The air in Cairo's Khan el-Khalili Bazaar in the year 1324 was thick and heavy, like molten glass. It smelled of cinnamon, sweat, and panic. An old cloth merchant named Ibrahim turned a gold dinar over and over in his calloused fingers for the 100th time. The coin was solid, the minting was clear, the familiar image beyond doubt, but its value was evaporating before his eyes, like morning dew under the relentless Egyptian sun. Just a week ago, this dinar could have bought him an entire bale of Damascus silk. Today, it barely stretched to a few cubits of coarse cotton. Around him buzzed a hive of human desperation. Money changers stared in horror at their now worthless mountains of metal. Buyers screamed at sellers demanding yesterday's prices, and the sellers could only spread their hands in helpless gestures. The economic heart of the greatest city in the Islamic world was feverish, its arteries poisoned. The source of this poison was not a curse or a war, but something unimaginable: generosity. Rumors, growing more fantastic with every telling, crept through the city about a mysterious ruler from the depths of Africa, from lands marked on maps only with the heads of monsters. His name was Mansa Musa, king of the Mali Empire. It was said his caravan stretched for many days' journey, that his 12,000 servants were dressed in brocade the Sultan himself would envy, and that 80 camels carried not goods, but pure gold, clear as a tear. He wasn't trading, nor conquering, he was giving. He tossed handfuls of gold dust to beggars, showered emirs with gold bars, and paid triple for any goods without haggling. He brought a golden rain to Cairo, and this blessed, generous rain turned out to be acid, eating away at the very foundations of prosperity. Ibrahim looked at his useless dinar, and his eyes reflected the great, incomprehensible paradox of the age. How could the most pious and generous act of the richest man in history become an act of total economic destruction? To understand how a gift can kill and piety can ruin, we must look at the world where this king's gold was just a shiny stone, and the world he unwittingly crushed with it. The world into which Mansa Musa was about to pour his river of gold was a giant chessboard, where games had been played for centuries with pieces made of steel, faith, and silk. On one end of the board, Europe was just beginning to stir from the gloom of the early Middle Ages. Its kingdoms were a patchwork of feudal squabbles, its ambitions fueled by Marco Polo's tales of the East's untold riches. The Italian maritime republics, Venice and Genoa, circled the Mediterranean like predatory gulls, controlling trade routes and siphoning off gold in exchange for spices and silks. The Byzantine Empire, once the shining Constantinople, was a mere shadow of its former glory, weakened by crusaders and pressed by the Turks. At the center of this board, standing firm and unbreakable, was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. This was not just a country, but a military machine run by an elite of slave warriors, a bastion of Islam that had halted the Mongol invasion and driven the last crusaders from the Holy Land. Cairo was not just a capital, but a global melting pot where caravan routes from Asia, sea lanes from Europe, and critically, secret trails from the depths of Africa converged. It was along these trails, through the merciless Sahara, that the most desired commodity, gold, trickled into Egypt. Its origin was shrouded in mystery. European and Arab cartographers could only guess at the existence of mythical, gold-flowing rivers somewhere to the south. And in this geopolitical arrangement, the Mali Empire was like an undersea volcano, invisible to most players, but possessing colossal, dormant power. To the Egyptian Sultan, the Venetian Doge, or any European monarch, Mali was an abstraction, a distant land of barbarians. They failed to realize that it was a centralized, complex state, larger than all of Western Europe, with an organized army, a developed administration, and most importantly, near monopolistic control over half the world's gold supply. A clash between this invisible giant and the established world order was inevitable. And Mansa Musa's Hajj was destined to be not just a pilgrimage, but a thundering announcement of his existence, an act that would forever erase Mali from the blank spots on the maps and write its name in history, in letters of gold, but also, as it turned out, of destruction. Mansa Musa was no upstart, no nouveau riche who had stumbled upon a gold mine. Behind him stood the shadows of his ancestors, and in his veins flowed the blood of Sundiata Keita, the legendary Lion King, whose story was not just a biography but a national epic, the very foundation upon which the empire was built. Sundiata, born in the 13th century, was a prince despised for his physical weakness. He could not walk. But, as the epic tells, when an enemy, the cruel sorcerer Sumaoro Kante, conquered his homeland, an incredible strength awakened within the prince. He tore a baobab tree from the ground to use as a staff, gathered loyal warriors around him, and in a decisive battle crushed the tyrant. This was not merely a victory, it was an act of creation. Sundiata Keita united the warring Mandinka tribes, created a code of laws known as the Kurukan Fuga, a kind of constitution regulating society, and laid the groundwork for the Mali Empire. He was both an Alexander and a Lycurgus to his people. This legacy was both a blessing and a burden for Mansa Musa. He inherited not just territory and a treasury, but a sacred authority. The idea that the Mansa, the ruler, is not merely an administrator, but a guardian of harmony between the world of humans and the world of spirits. Power in Mali was steeped in mysticism, in the belief that the ruler's piety and justice ensured the fertility of the land and the richness of the earth. Therefore, when Musa ascended to the throne, he understood that his wealth was not his personal property, but a divine trust. And the best way to prove his right to the throne and his legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects and the entire Islamic world was to demonstrate not only the military might inherited from the Lion King, but also an unparalleled piety. His generosity during the Hajj was not just a grand gesture, but a deeply rooted political and religious act, a confirmation of his status as Sundiata's true heir. He carried on his camels not just gold, he carried the full weight and majesty of his dynasty, seeking to show the world that the lions of Mali were second in nobility to no other monarch on earth. Mansa Musa's path to absolute power began with an empty throne, left by a dreamer, which gave his ascension an aura of fatal predetermination. His immediate predecessor was Mansa Abubakar Tsekhtu, a ruler whose ambitions were turned not to the land, but to the sea. Not to expanding borders, but to pushing the horizons of knowledge. According to the chronicles, particularly as recorded by the Arab scholar al-Umari from Musa's own account, Abu Bakr was obsessed with the idea of discovering what lay on the other side of the great Atlantic Ocean. He believed this surrounding sea must have an opposite shore. First, he equipped an expedition of 200 ships filled with men, and another 200 loaded with gold, provisions, and water for several years, and sent them west with a single order. Do not return until you reach the edge of the ocean or your supplies run out. After a long time, only one ship returned. Its captain told a terrifying story of how the fleet had entered a powerful current, like a river in the middle of the ocean, which swept all the other ships into a giant whirlpool, and they vanished. But this failure did not stop Abu Bakr too. It only fueled his curiosity. He decided to lead the next expedition himself. He fitted out a fleet of 2,000 vessels, handed over the regency and the full powers of government to his vizier, who was Musa, and sailed west, never to return. This story, bordering on legend, was of colossal importance for Musa's rise. He did not seize power in a bloody struggle or through intrigue. Power literally fell into his hands because his predecessor chose the unknown over dominion. This created a unique psychological situation for Musa. On one hand, he was obligated to prove himself worthy of the throne, to show he was not just a temporary regent, but a true Mansa. On the other hand, the shadow of the ambitious and courageous Abu Bakr, who had challenged the very gods and the ocean, must have weighed on him. Perhaps this is what pushed Musa to accomplish something equally grandiose, but on a different plane. If Abu Bakr sought glory in geographical discovery, Musa decided to find it in a display of spiritual and material power. His Hajj became an answer to his predecessor's challenge. You went in search of new worlds, but I will show the old world a wonder it will never forget. Before becoming a living legend, whose name was whispered in markets from Cairo to Granada, Musa went through a long and harsh apprenticeship in the forge of power, where his character was tempered in the shadow of golden mountains and under the scorching Sahel sun. His childhood and youth were not idle, like those of many crown princes. The Mali Empire, despite its riches, was a highly complex organism, composed of numerous conquered peoples, each with its own language, traditions, and ambitions. Governing such a state required not only strength, but also a profound intellect. Musa received a brilliant education, available only to the highest elite of the Islamic world. At his service were scholars and theologians who taught him not only the Quran and Arabic, but also mathematics, astronomy, and most importantly, the art of governance. From a young age, he was immersed in administrative work, governing entire provinces under the supervision of experienced advisors. It was the perfect schooling. He learned firsthand how the tax collection system worked, how to resolve disputes between communities, and how to secure the vital caravan routes that were the empire's lifeblood. It was there that he grasped the great economic paradox of his world. In his land, gold was so abundant that it was used to decorate weapons and even dog collars, while salt, brought by caravans from the north, from the mines of Taghaza, was valued literally at its weight in gold because it was essential for the survival of people and livestock in the hot climate. He understood that true power lay not in the mere possession of gold, but in controlling its flow and the flow of what it could be exchanged for. This experience forged him into not just a warrior or a monarch, but a brilliant economist and strategist of his time. He was no naive barbarian, blinded by the glitter of his own wealth. He was a calculated and far-sighted ruler who knew exactly how his empire functioned. And it was this knowledge, this confidence in his own value system, that became the cause of the catastrophe he unwittingly unleashed when he collided with a world that operated on entirely different economic laws. He was a genius in his own universe, but outside of it, his genius turned to destruction. Ascending to the throne left by his dreamer predecessor, Mansa Musa did not rest on his laurels. The first years of his reign were a harsh test, the first trial of his strength, where he had to prove he was worthy of the Lion King's legacy, not just by blood, but by spirit. The empire he inherited was vast and rich, but not monolithic. On its peripheries, among the conquered peoples, embers of discontent flared up time and again. The vital trans-Saharan trade routes, through which flowed streams of gold to the north and salt to the south, were under constant threat from nomadic raids. Musa acted decisively and ruthlessly. He reorganized the army, making it more mobile and effective, and conducted a series of swift military campaigns to pacify rebellious provinces and secure the caravan routes. His greatest strategic achievement was establishing full control over the two key cities that were the jewels of the trans-Saharan trade, Timbuktu and Gao. These cities were not just transit points, but gateways through which the wealth of West Africa entered the Mediterranean and the Middle East. By bringing them under his direct control, Musa closed the entire economic circuit. Now, not a single grain of gold, not a single bar of salt could cross the desert without his knowledge and without enriching his treasury. It was a masterstroke that transformed the Mali Empire from a mere supplier of raw materials into a major player dictating terms on a vast market. He did not just collect tribute. He created a centralized system where all economic threads converged in his hands. These early actions revealed his unique talent, a combination of military force and economic foresight. He proved himself not just a conqueror, but an architect of a system, an empire builder. He turned Mali into a single, well-oiled machine for extracting and distributing wealth. And when this machine was perfected, he decided to show it to the world. His future pilgrimage was no spontaneous decision, but the logical conclusion of this titanic work, a demonstration to the world of the power of the machine he had so long and carefully built. Behind the grand facade of power, piety, and immense wealth lay a deeply personal, almost secret motivation that may have been the true engine of the most spectacular pilgrimage in history. Some Arab chroniclers, citing oral traditions, hint at a tragic event in Mansa Musa's life that could have become his inner demon, a sin demanding great atonement. Legend has it that he was responsible for the death of his own mother, Nana Komban. The details vary. Some sources speak of an accidental shot during a hunt. Others of an accident in which he was indirectly culpable. Regardless of the circumstances, for a deeply religious man living in a culture where reverence for ancestors and parents was sacred, such an act, even if unintentional, would have been a terrible burden on his soul. In Islamic tradition, the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, is one of the 5 pillars of faith, an act of purification and repentance capable of washing away sins. For a ruler of Musa's stature, a simple, modest pilgrimage would have been insufficient. His sin, if it existed, was great in his eyes, and therefore the atonement had to be unprecedented. Perhaps that is why his Hajj transformed into something more than just a religious rite. It was a desperate attempt to silence his inner demon, to atone for his guilt before God and his mother's shadow through an act of colossal, almost godlike generosity. Every handful of gold tossed to a beggar, every mosque built in the desert, every gift presented to an emir might have been not just a display of wealth, but a part of his personal penance. He seemed to be trying to buy forgiveness from the Almighty, paying for it with the most valuable thing he possessed. This secret motivation adds a tragic depth to his character. He ceases to be merely a proud monarch flaunting his fortune. He appears before us as a complex, suffering individual, torn between guilt and the burden of power. His golden caravan becomes not just a procession, but a pilgrimage of penance, and his generosity, which ruined entire countries, becomes a side effect of one man's desperate search for peace of mind. Once the decision for the Hajj was made, Mansa Musa began to organize it with a method and scale worthy of the greatest logistician in history. This was not just preparation for a journey, but the mobilization of an entire state, the creation of an autonomous, moving city on the march. Imagine a golden river beginning its slow, inexorable journey from the heart of West Africa to cross an ocean of sand and flow into the Mediterranean world. This river consisted of 60,000 people. At the vanguard marched 500 heralds, dressed in Persian silk and carrying golden staffs weighing nearly 3 kilograms each, their voices carrying across the savannah, announcing the arrival of their lord. The core of the procession was the personal guard and court. Thousands of warriors, officials, musicians, cooks, and physicians. But the most astonishing part of this living stream was the 12,000 slaves, each dressed in precious brocade and carrying another golden staff. They were not merely servants, but a walking demonstration that in the Mali Empire, even slaves looked wealthier than some kings. And behind them followed the pack train, the very essence of the enterprise. 80, or by some accounts, 100 camels, and every single one of them was laden with sacks containing between 50 and 150 kilograms of the purest gold dust. The total amount of gold Musa carried with him, by the most conservative estimates, was over 12 tons. This was a fortune capable of changing the economy of any country overnight. But Musa carried not only gold. The caravan was loaded with provisions, water, fodder for the animals, mobile tents, and everything necessary for a journey of many months. This was no spontaneous display of wealth, but a meticulously planned military economic operation. Musa understood that the path through the Sahara was a death trap, and he intended to cross it not as a petitioner, but as a master. His caravan was not just a pilgrimage, it was the Mali Empire itself in miniature, setting out to show its face to the world, and that face was made of pure gold. To fully grasp the scale of the paradox Mansa Musa created, one must understand the unique economic reality of his own empire. At the zenith of its power, under his rule, Mali was a state where concepts of value, common to the rest of the world, were turned upside down. The empire stretched from the Atlantic coast in the west to the bend of the Niger River in the east, encompassing the territories of modern-day Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, and parts of Niger and Mauritania. This was an area comparable in size to all of Western Europe, and within this vast territory lay the legendary gold mines of Bambouk, Bouré, and Galam, which, according to historians' estimates, supplied about half of all the gold known in the Old World in the 14th century. Gold was so common that its mining and use were strictly regulated. The Mansa was considered the owner of all gold nuggets, while his subjects were allowed to freely trade in gold dust. This led to a surprising situation. Gold, being incredibly abundant, did not possess the sacred value attributed to it in Europe and the Middle East. It was more of a prestige commodity, a raw material for artisans, a means of displaying status, but not the foundation of the entire monetary system. A far more vital commodity for survival was salt. In the hot climate of the Sahel, salt was not just a seasoning, but a crucial preservative and an essential element for maintaining the health of people and livestock. And it was mined in the heart of the Sahara, in the salt mines of Tagaza, from where it was transported in huge slabs by camel caravans. As a result, in the markets of Timbuktu and Djinguereber, a unique situation arose where 1 pound of salt was exchanged for 1 pound of gold. To a European or Arab merchant, this was sheer madness. To a resident of Mali, it was a normal, logical price. Mansa Musa grew up and ruled in this world. He sincerely could not understand how it could be otherwise. For him, gold was a renewable resource, a symbol of divine favor to be generously distributed to affirm his status. He simply could not imagine that economies existed elsewhere so fragile and dependent on this metal, that an infusion of even a small part of his treasures could cause not prosperity, but collapse. The journey across the Sahara was in itself a tactical masterpiece, a demonstration not only of wealth, but also of incredible organization and faith. The Great Desert was a merciless enemy, an ocean of sand that swallowed caravans without a trace, leaving not even bones behind. But Mansa Musa crossed it not as a traveler, but as a monarch, changing the very landscape in his path. His logistics were flawless. Scouts went far ahead to secure the route and find water sources. Huge stores of provisions and fodder allowed the caravan to be completely self-sufficient for weeks on end. But the most astonishing manifestation of his power and piety was a tradition he established. According to the chronicles, every Friday, the holy day for Muslims, wherever his caravan stopped, Mansa Musa ordered a mosque to be built. In the desert, where the only building materials were sand and clay, these were, of course, not grand structures, but modest prayer houses. But the act itself was unprecedented. He literally left a trail of God's houses behind him, marking his path through the godless, as it was believed, wilderness. This was a powerful symbolic statement. He was not just going to Mecca, he was bringing civilization with him, sanctifying the land his foot trod upon. This transformed his Hajj from a personal pilgrimage into a missionary expedition. However, within this brilliant display of strength and faith lay his fatal strategic error. He was so focused on his internal value system, on his understanding of the world, that he completely failed to consider how that world would react to him. He thought in terms of faith, prestige, and demonstration of power. He did not think in terms of supply and demand, inflation, and the stability of a currency. His genius as an administrator and logistician worked flawlessly in the preparation and execution of the journey itself. But his complete misunderstanding of the laws of international economics, which he was about to encounter in Cairo, proved to be his undoing. He went to conquer the world with his generosity, not realizing that this weapon was double-edged and could strike not only others, but also his own interests. The moment of truth arrived in Cairo, the glittering capital of the Mamluk Sultanate. The arrival of Mansa Musa's caravan was like a scene from the tales of 1001 Nights. The entire city poured into the streets to gaze at this unprecedented marvel. The rumors that had preceded the caravan proved to be a pale shadow of reality. The sight of thousands of people in silks, the glint of golden staffs, the proud gait of camels laden with precious metal, all of it stunned and shocked the Cairenes to their very core. The news immediately reached Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, a powerful and proud ruler, unaccustomed to anyone in his domain outshining his own magnificence. The meeting of the two monarchs became a tense diplomatic duel, a clash of two worlds and two egos. According to protocol, anyone who came before the Sultan was required to kiss the ground at his feet. But when Mansa Musa was invited to the palace, he flatly refused to do so. His reply, delivered through his courtiers, was filled with pride and piety. "I prostrate myself only before Allah, who created me." This was an unheard-of challenge, a direct insult to one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world. The tension in the palace reached its peak. The Sultan's advisors insisted on a harsh response. But al-Nasir Muhammad, being a wise politician, found an elegant solution. He allowed Musa to prostrate himself, but formally he was doing so not before the Sultan, but in the direction of Mecca, as if in prayer. This compromise allowed both to save face. But this episode was crucial. It showed that Mansa Musa had not come as a petitioner or a vassal. He saw himself as an equal, if not superior, to any other monarch. He was willing to obey the laws of Islam, but not the laws of men, even if those men were sultans. This meeting set the tone for his entire stay in Cairo. He was a guest, but a guest who dictated his own rules. And one of those rules was his own boundless generosity, which he would soon unleash upon the unsuspecting city. Once in Cairo, with diplomatic formalities settled, Mansa Musa faced a fateful choice that would define his place in history and become the core of his paradox. He could have behaved like any other wealthy pilgrim, exchange his gold for local currency, purchase goods, pay his expenses, and move on. This would have been the reasonable, pragmatic path, allowing him to preserve and even increase his fortune. But Musa was not just a pilgrim. He was the embodiment of the idea that wealth is given by God to be shared. He stood at a crossroads of destiny, to open his coffers and unleash a golden deluge upon the city, following his cultural and religious convictions, or to act with restraint, respecting a foreign economic order. He chose the former. And this decision was dictated not by foolishness or vanity, but by the entire logic of his civilization. In the Mali Empire, a ruler's status and power were confirmed not by accumulation, but by the distribution of wealth. The gift economy posited that the more you give away, the more powerful you are. To abandon this practice in Cairo would have been to betray himself and the very foundations of power upon which his empire rested. So he began to give. He didn't just spend. He handed out gold in unimaginable quantities. His courtiers showered the Sultan's officials with gifts. He paid for any trinket in the market with so much gold dust that merchants were left speechless. He gave alms to the poor, not in small coins, but in whole ingots. To the people of Cairo, it seemed like a miracle. But it was a miracle with a delayed curse. Every act of his generosity was a nail hammered into the coffin of the Egyptian economy. He saturated the market with gold, the very metal that was the basis of the Mamluk Sultanate's monetary system. And the more gold appeared on the market, the less it was worth. Musa, acting from the most pious of motives, had unwittingly triggered the mechanism of hyperinflation. His choice at this crossroads was not merely an economic decision, it was a civilizational act. He applied the laws of his world to another, and the result was catastrophic, turning his virtue into a destructive force. During the 3 months that Mansa Musa spent in Cairo, he reached the absolute pinnacle of his power and perhaps experienced the very moment of pride that the Greeks called hubris, a challenge thrown by a mortal to the gods and fate. The city was at his feet. Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, who had initially looked down on him, now saw him not just as a wealthy guest, but as a force to be reckoned with. The court emirs, accustomed to luxury, were blinded and humbled by a wealth that seemed inexhaustible. Mansa Musa's name was on everyone's lips. Legends were woven about him. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, and other corners of the Mediterranean who were in Cairo at the time spread the news of him throughout the known world. He became a living myth, a king from the land of Ophir whose treasures surpassed those of Solomon. At that moment, he was not just the ruler of Mali, he was the most influential man on the planet. His word, backed by an endless flow of gold, carried weight. He was effectively controlling Cairo's economy without even realizing it. If he liked an item, he could pay any price for it, instantly making its seller a rich man and sending the prices of similar goods skyrocketing. If he wished to honor someone with a gift, that person became wealthy overnight. He played the part of a deity, dispensing blessings, a decider of fates. And in this, likely, lay his hubris. He was so confident in his value system, in the belief that his generosity was an absolute good, that he failed to notice the devastating consequences of his actions. He saw only the admiration in people's eyes, heard only words of gratitude. He was blinded by the glare of his own gold and the radiance of his own glory. This moment of triumph was also the beginning of his greatest mistake. He had reached a summit from which, as is often the case in great tragedies, the only way was down. And the fall, not his own personal fall, but that of an entire economic system he had unwittingly undermined, was not far off. While Mansa Musa bathed in the rays of glory, the first cracks in the foundation of Egyptian prosperity began to appear in the shadowy alleys of the Cairo bazaar. At first it was a quiet whisper, bewildered conversations among merchants who couldn't understand why their goods were no longer selling. Then the whisper grew into an anxious roar. The mechanism was simple and ruthless. The enormous amount of new gold injected into the economy drastically increased the money supply. But the quantity of goods, grain, textiles, spices, livestock, remained the same. According to a basic law of economics, which Musa did not know but which worked nonetheless, money began to rapidly lose its value. Hyperinflation set in. A man who yesterday had received a hefty gold ingot from the generous king and considered himself rich, today discovered that this ingot could buy no more than a single copper coin could have bought yesterday. Prices shot up to the heavens. A baker selling bread had to raise his price every hour because the flour he needed for the next batch was becoming more expensive by the minute. A weaver, having received a mountain of gold for his cloth, couldn't buy wool with it because a shepherd was now demanding 10 times more for his sheep. The economy, built on trust in the value of money, began to crumble. Savings that people had accumulated over years turned to dust. Trade contracts became meaningless. A paralysis began. What had started as a divine blessing had turned into an economic plague. The people who had looked upon Musa's caravan with awe now cursed his generosity. They were richer than ever, yet they were starving because their gold was worthless. These were the first harbingers of the storm, the first signs that generosity not measured against reality can be more destructive than an army of conquerors. Mansa Musa came to Cairo not with a sword, but with an open hand. But the blow from that hand proved devastating for the city. The culmination of Mansa Musa's stay in Cairo was his fatal act, the final and complete destruction of the local gold market, an event that has gone down in the annals of economic history. It wasn't a single action, but the result of a 3-month, systematic and relentless policy of distributing wealth. By the time Musa was preparing to leave the city to continue his journey to Mecca, Cairo's economy was already in agony. The value of the gold dinar, the region's main currency, had plummeted by 25%, and by some estimates, even more. It was a collapse unseen since the times of wars and great plagues. The Arab historian al-Makrizi, writing later, noted that it took the Egyptian economy more than a decade to recover from the consequences of this golden visit. 10 years of poverty, instability, and chaos, caused not by an enemy invasion, but by an act of unprecedented generosity. The central paradox stated at the beginning of our story was revealed here in all its tragic and absurd power. A man, guided by piety, wishing to demonstrate the greatness of his faith and his country, dealt the mighty Mamluk Sultanate, the bastion of Islam, a blow comparable to a crushing military defeat. He did it without a single shot, without a single sword, using only his treasury as a weapon. This event became a turning point not only for Egypt, but for Musa himself. It was at this moment that the myth of his wealth began its journey around the world, but with it also came the tale of the destructive consequences of his generosity. He wanted to go down in history as the most pious pilgrim, but he also went down as the man who broke gold. This fatal act forever changed the perception of Mali and its ruler. From a mysterious, distant land, it transformed into a real force, capable, albeit unintentionally, of influencing the destinies of entire nations. And this lesson about the interconnectedness of the world and the fragility of economic systems was taught in the most brutal and graphic way possible. The question of whether Mansa Musa was fully aware of the chaos he left behind in Cairo is key to understanding his character. Was he a naive savage, blindly squandering his wealth? Or was he a ruler who faced the consequences of his actions and tried to rectify them? The answer to this question transforms him from a simple historical figure into a complex, tragic hero. The accounts of chroniclers, particularly Al-Umari, who visited Cairo 12 years after Musa's visit but still found vivid memories of it, support the latter view. According to them, on his return journey from Mecca, passing through Cairo again, Musa saw what he had done. He was confronted with the consequences of his generosity: devalued money, skyrocketing prices, and ruined merchants. And he did something astounding. He tried to fix the situation. He began borrowing money from Cairo's moneylenders at absolutely predatory, unbelievable interest rates. Furthermore, he started buying back his own gold, paying far more for it than it was worth at the time. It was a desperate and, from the perspective of modern economics, rather clumsy yet meaningful step. He was attempting to remove the excess money supply from the market to restore the value of gold. This act completely changes his image. It shows that Musa was not indifferent to the consequences. He felt a sense of responsibility. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he encountered an economic system that did not operate by the laws of his empire, and it came as a shock. His internal struggle at that moment must have been colossal. On one hand, his pride as the great Mansa; on the other, the realization of his mistake and the duty of a pious Muslim not to harm his brothers in faith. This episode of borrowing gold is an act of repentance. It shows that Musa was capable of reflection and learning. He didn't just destroy another's economy. He tried to save it, paying for it with his own gold. And though his attempt was not entirely successful, the damage was too great. It attests to his greatness not only as the richest, but also as a responsible, albeit one who made a monumental error, ruler. Leaving Cairo, which lay in the ruins of its economy, Mansa Musa continued his journey towards his main goal, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. His caravan, though somewhat diminished by his lavish spending, was still a grand spectacle. Crossing the Sinai Peninsula and entering the lands of the Hejaz, he was entering the heart of the Islamic world, the place to which the souls of millions of Muslims aspired. Here, his wealth and generosity took on an entirely different meaning. If in Cairo, the center of world trade and politics, his gold had become an economic poison, then in Mecca and Medina, cities that lived largely off pilgrims and donations, his gifts were received as a true blessing. He showered the descendants of the Prophet with gold and made generous donations for the upkeep of the main mosques, Al-Haram in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. He paid the debts of pilgrims stranded in the holy cities without means of subsistence, fed the poor, and financed the construction of new caravanserais and water sources along the pilgrimage routes. Here, his generosity was appropriate and harmonious. It did not destroy the economy, but rather supported and strengthened its infrastructure, which was designed for precisely such infusions. In the holy cities, Musa behaved not as a proud monarch, but as a humble servant of God. He shaved his head, donned the simple white ihram consisting of 2 pieces of unstitched cloth, and, alongside everyone else, performed all the prescribed rituals: the circumambulation of the Kaaba, the running between the hills of Safa and Marwa, the standing on Mount Arafat. In these rituals, he found what he so deeply sought: spiritual purification and atonement. He had reached the goal of his journey. However, even at the center of the spiritual universe, he could not completely escape the shadow of what he had left behind. News of the economic collapse in Cairo, the main transit point for all pilgrims, undoubtedly reached Mecca as well. And his triumph as a pilgrim was marred by the knowledge that the path to this triumph was paved not only with gold, but also with the ruin of his brothers in faith. In the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, Mansa Musa finally found what he had undertaken his titanic journey for: spiritual fulfillment and the status of one of the most pious rulers in the Islamic world. He performed all the rites of the Hajj with a diligence and humility that astonished eyewitnesses. For a man who possessed almost limitless power and wealth, the ability to stand alongside the poorest beggar under the scorching sun on Mount Arafat, praying for forgiveness, was the highest expression of his faith. He returned from Mecca with the honorary title of Hajji, which in the Islamic world testified not only to the completion of the pilgrimage, but also to high spiritual authority. His name was now spoken with respect in the most remote corners of the Muslim ecumen. He had achieved his goal. He had announced himself and his empire, not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a true servant of Allah. However, this undeniable spiritual triumph was inseparable from the economic fiasco he had caused. The story of his Hajj became a tale with 2 faces. On one hand, it was a story of unparalleled piety, of a ruler who spared no treasure to fulfill his religious duty. On the other hand, it was a parable about the destructive power of wealth, about how good intentions can pave the road to economic hell. This dualism is the essence of his legacy. In the eyes of theologians, he was an exemplary monarch. In the eyes of economists, had they existed then in the modern sense, he was a disaster. This paradox haunted him to the end of his journey. He returned home not only with the title of Hajji, but also with a new, bitter knowledge of how the world worked beyond his golden empire. He understood that different value systems exist, and what is a virtue in one can become a destructive force in another. His spiritual triumph was paid for at a high price: the realization of his own mistake, and the understanding that the world is far more complex and interconnected than he could have imagined sitting on his throne in Nayani. On his return journey from Mecca, Mansa Musa demonstrated that he was not just a monarch capable of spending, but also a ruler who knew how to acquire. And his most valuable acquisition was not the gold he tried to borrow in Cairo, but human capital. The knowledge and talents he decided to bring back to his empire. He understood that the true greatness of a state lies not only in material wealth, but also in cultural and intellectual development. During his journey, he met with the outstanding minds of the Islamic world: scholars, poets, theologians, architects. He was captivated by the sophistication and splendor of the architecture in Cairo and other cities he visited, and he decided to bring a piece of this magnificence to his own country. The key figure he managed to persuade to follow him to Mali was Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. Al-Sahili was a poet and architect from Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, which at that time was one of the brightest cultural centers in the world. He was a bearer of the advanced Andalusian architectural traditions, which combined Moorish elegance with innovative construction techniques. Musa offered him, according to legend, 200 kilograms of gold to come with him and become the chief architect of his empire. It was an incredible offer that al-Sahili could not refuse. This decision by Musa was brilliant and far-sighted. He didn't just hire a foreign specialist. He imported an entire architectural school, new technologies, and a new aesthetic vision into West Africa. He understood that for his empire to take its rightful place on the world stage, it needed not only gold and an army, but also visible symbols of its greatness, mosques, palaces, and universities that could rival the finest examples in the Islamic world. By bringing al-Sahili with him, Musa was laying the foundation for a cultural revolution in his country. He was bringing home not just an architect, he was bringing a builder of a new world, a man who would help him transform the capitals of his empire into centers of knowledge and faith, whose fame would outlive the fame of his gold. The second arrival in Cairo on the return journey was a moment of sobering reality and a harsh lesson for Mansa Musa. The city he had left months earlier at the zenith of his triumph greeted him with economic ruin and a dull murmur of discontent. Now he could witness firsthand the long-term consequences of his unrestrained generosity. He saw merchants whose shops were full of gold but empty of goods. He saw people who cursed the day his golden rain had fallen upon them. For a proud monarch accustomed to adoration and admiration, this must have been a heavy blow. But it is his reaction to this catastrophe that sets him apart from ordinary tyrants or vain rulers. He did not ignore the problem or blame someone else. He accepted his responsibility. As mentioned earlier, he made a desperate attempt to stabilize the market by borrowing gold at enormous interest rates and buying it back at inflated prices. This act was not only economic, but also deeply symbolic. It showed that Mansa Musa was not a heartless barbarian, but a man of honor. He had disrupted the balance, and he tried to restore it, even if it cost him a significant part of his fortune. This stay in a ruined Cairo became a true university for him. He learned the laws of supply and demand firsthand, understood what inflation was, and how fragile an economic system based on the scarcity of a particular commodity could be. This bitter experience likely influenced all his subsequent policies. He returned to Mali not only as a celebrated pilgrim, but also as a ruler who had learned a priceless, though costly, lesson in international economics. He had left home believing his gold was a universal tool for demonstrating power. He returned understanding that it was a potent weapon that must be wielded with the utmost caution. The journey through a devastated Cairo completed his transformation. From a powerful African king, he evolved into a world-class statesman, aware of the complexity and interconnectedness of global processes. Upon returning to his homeland, Mansa Musa began the most important and enduring chapter of his reign, the transformation of his empire from a merely wealthy state into one of the world's leading cultural and intellectual centers. The lesson learned in Cairo and the knowledge brought back from his journey convinced him that true greatness is not measured in tons of gold alone. He directed his inexhaustible energy and resources into a grand construction program that would forever change the face of his capitals. The main instrument of this transformation was the architect al-Sahili. Their first and most famous joint project was the construction of the Djinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu. Al-Sahili employed a technique new to the region, building with banco, mud brick made of clay and straw, reinforced with a wooden frame. He created a unique architectural style that became the hallmark of the entire region and was later named Sudanese. The Djinguereber Mosque, with its characteristic conical towers and exposed wooden beams, became not just a place of prayer, but a symbol of a new era. But Musa did not stop there. Next to the mosque, he ordered the construction of a madrasa, which eventually grew into the famous Sankore University. He invited scholars and theologians from all over the Islamic world, from Fez to Cairo, offering them generous stipends and ideal working conditions. On his orders, agents bought up the most valuable manuscripts throughout North Africa and the Middle East, creating a library that could rival the finest collections of the time in its richness. Similar construction projects were launched in other cities, notably Gao. Mansa Musa was effectively launching a program of national projects aimed at developing education, religion, and culture. He transformed Timbuktu, previously just a dusty trading town on the edge of the desert, into the Pearl of the Sahara, a beacon of knowledge whose light attracted students and scholars from all over Africa. This was his wisest investment. The gold he gave away in Cairo evaporated, causing only chaos. But the gold invested in building universities and libraries yielded fruits that his empire would harvest for many decades to come. As a result of Mansa Musa's deliberate policy, a remarkable transformation of values occurred within his empire, especially in Timbuktu, another paradox generated by this extraordinary ruler. In the world he had so astounded with his gold, the most valuable commodity in his own capital became not precious metals, but books. The University of Sankore and its adjacent madrasas attracted thousands of students. The demand for books on theology, law, astronomy, mathematics, rhetoric was immense. Manuscript copyists became one of the most respected and well-paid professions. As travelers who visited Timbuktu in the following decades, such as the famous Leo Africanus testified, the book market in the city was the most vibrant and profitable. A valuable manuscript could cost far more than a slave or even several camels. This created a unique intellectual atmosphere. The city lived by books. Scholars held debates in the streets, and students memorized texts while sitting in the shade of the mosques. A person's wealth came to be measured not only by the amount of their gold, but also by the size of their personal library. This was a direct result of Musa's actions. He, the man whose name became synonymous with gold, had in fact laid the foundation for a civilization based on knowledge. This was his most profound and ironic victory. He showed the world the power of his gold, but at home, he proved the superiority of wisdom. He intuitively understood what many rulers fail to grasp even today. Material resources are finite and their value is relative, whereas knowledge is capital that only multiplies when shared. The legacy of Mansa Musa is not just the legends of his wealth, nor just the economic collapse in Cairo. His true legacy is the libraries of Timbuktu, the culture of reverence for the book that he nurtured. He, the richest man in history, ultimately left behind something far more valuable than all the gold in the world, a civilization where a book was worth more than gold. The fame of Mansa Musa's incredible pilgrimage spread like ripples on water throughout the known world, and it made an especially strong impression on Europe. For 14th-century Europeans, Africa south of the Sahara was a land of myths and monsters, terra incognita. The stories of the African king's wealth, relayed by Venetian and Genoese merchants from Cairo, fell on fertile ground, mixing with legends of the kingdom of Prester John and the biblical land of Ophir. The name Mansa Musa became a symbol, an idea of inexhaustible treasures hidden in the depths of a mysterious continent. The pinnacle of this myth-making was his depiction in the famous Catalan Atlas of 1375. This atlas, created by Jewish cartographers in Majorca, was the most accurate and detailed map of the world of its time. And on the sheet dedicated to Africa, in the very center of West Africa, was a depiction of a dark-skinned monarch seated on a throne, wearing a golden crown. In one hand, he held a golden scepter, and in the other, a huge gold nugget. The caption read, "This black lord is Musa Mali, lord of the blacks of Guinea. This king is the richest and most noble lord of all this land, because of the abundance of gold which is dug up in his country." To appear on the world's main map was tantamount to official recognition. Mansa Musa and his empire ceased to be rumors. They became a geopolitical reality put on the map. This had far-reaching consequences. On one hand, it fueled the interest of Europeans, especially the Portuguese, in finding a sea route to West Africa to bypass the Muslim-controlled trans-Saharan routes. The dream of reaching Mansa Musa's gold became one of the driving forces of the age of discovery. On the other hand, it created a stereotypical image of Africa as a continent whose only value lay in its natural resources. Musa wanted to put his empire on the map as a great Islamic power, and he succeeded. But the price of this fame was high. He forever linked the image of his continent in the European mind with the image of immense but easily accessible gold, which would have tragic consequences in the future. Even at the pinnacle of his power and international fame, Mansa Musa could not afford to relax. His gigantic empire, stitched together from the patches of many different peoples and cultures, required constant attention and control. While he was undertaking his years-long pilgrimage, showcasing the greatness of Mali to the world, signs of instability began to appear on the fringes of his domain. The most serious challenge was a rebellion in the strategically vital city of Gao. Gao was the capital of the once mighty Songhai Empire, conquered by Mali, and it remained a center of separatist sentiment. Taking advantage of the Mansa's long absence, local rulers rose up in rebellion, seeking to regain their independence. The news reached Musa on his return journey. He was forced to divert from his route and lead his army to pacify Gao. This episode, often overlooked amidst the glitter of his Hajj, is crucial for understanding the realities of his rule. It shows that even at the zenith of its glory, the empire was fragile. Its unity was held together by military force and the personal authority of the Mansa. His long absence immediately provoked centrifugal forces. Musa crushed the rebellion, took the sons of Gao's ruler as hostages, and reasserted his authority. But it was an ominous sign. It became clear that governing such a vast and diverse territory was a titanic task. The prosperity and stability of the empire depended directly on the personality of its ruler. As long as a brilliant administrator and strong leader like Musa was at the helm, the system worked. But what would happen after him? The rebellion in Gao was the first crack in the seemingly monolithic edifice of the empire. It foreshadowed future problems that would ultimately lead to its disintegration after the great Mansa's death. His pilgrimage brought him world fame, but at the same time, it exposed the internal vulnerability of his colossal state. Mansa Musa spent the last years of his life reaping the fruits of his great journey, while also bearing the immense burden of greatness on his shoulders. He returned to Mali not just as the most famous African ruler, but as a man whose worldview had been fundamentally changed. He dedicated himself to what we would today call cultural construction. He continued to fund the University of Sankore, turning it into a magnet for scholars. He built mosques and madrasas, strengthening the position of Islam in his empire, which in many ways was still pagan. His court in Niani became one of the most brilliant in the world, attracting poets, musicians, and artisans. But behind this facade of prosperity lay enormous difficulties. Governing an empire the size of Western Europe, without modern means of communication and transport, was a colossal task. The constant threat of rebellions on the peripheries, the need to protect trade routes from nomadic raids, and resolving disputes among numerous vassal rulers. All this demanded his unceasing effort. He probably felt that the golden age of Mali he had created was closely tied to his own life and energy. He tried to create institutions, an administrative system, a legal framework, educational centers that could outlive him. But the traditions of personalized power in the region were too strong. The greatness of the empire was the greatness of its Mansa. Over the years, this burden grew heavier. Having seen the world, he understood the fragility of his creation better than anyone. His final years are the story of a ruler trying to cement his legacy, to transform it from a personal achievement into a self-sustaining system. He did everything he could, but history showed that even the genius of one man cannot forever resist the centrifugal forces of history and human nature. He built a magnificent edifice, but its foundation ultimately rested on his own shoulders. The ironic finale to Mansa Musa's story is the most complete and unexpected answer to the main question: how did his generosity ruin other countries? The key lies not in malice or foolishness, but in the tragic collision of two completely different economic universes, two opposing philosophies of wealth. Mansa Musa was the product and supreme expression of a gift economy or potlatch system. In this system, common in many traditional societies, power, prestige, and social status are determined not by how much you accumulate, but by how much you are able to give away. Distributing wealth is not a loss, but a demonstration of strength, a confirmation that your resources are inexhaustible and your connection to the divine sources of prosperity is unshakable. His unbridled generosity in Cairo was not an act of vanity, but the only way he knew to assert his status as the greatest monarch. He acted in complete accordance with the laws of his civilization. But he applied these laws to a world that lived by entirely different rules, the laws of the Mediterranean's exchange economy. In this system, with roots in Phoenician, Greek, and Roman trade, value is determined not by abundance, but by scarcity. Gold was valuable not in itself, but because it was scarce, and it served as a universal, stable equivalent for valuing all other goods. The economy of the Mamluk Sultanate was like a finely tuned mechanism or a fragile ecosystem based on this balance. And Mansa Musa, without intending to, unleashed a whole asteroid of his gold upon this ecosystem. He unwittingly broke the basic principle of scarcity upon which everything rested. His gift was not perceived as a confirmation of status, but as a commodity intervention on a gigantic scale. Thus, the ruin of Cairo was not the result of one man's mistake, but the tragic and inevitable consequence of the first large-scale encounter in history between two fundamentally different economic paradigms. His generosity became destructive because the languages of wealth spoken by his world and the world of Cairo proved to be utterly untranslatable. The death of Mansa Musa, around the year 1337, marked the end of an era. He passed away at the peak of his empire's power, leaving his heirs a state whose name resounded throughout the world, whose cities were centers of learning, and whose treasury seemed inexhaustible. He departed from life not just as a ruler, but as a living legend, a man who had shown the world the true face of African might. But his passing, as is often the case with empires built around the personality of one great leader, exposed all the cracks that had been successfully hidden under the glitter of gold during his lifetime. His heirs, his son Magan the Fern and his brother Suleiman, were not without talent, but none possessed the unique combination of administrative genius, military prowess, and foresight that Musa had. The empire was too large, too diverse, to be governed without an iron will and unquestionable authority. A slow but inexorable process of disintegration began. Conquered peoples, like the Songhai and Gao, raised their heads again. Internal strife among the various branches of the ruling dynasty weakened central authority. The trade routes that Musa had so carefully protected became increasingly dangerous. Paradoxically, the very greatness Musa achieved contained the seeds of future decline. He had set the bar so high that his successors simply could not meet it. The fame of his wealth drew too much attention to the region, including unwanted attention. The empire he had made known to the world became too conspicuous a target. His death brought his story full circle. He was the architect of a golden age, but that age proved to be inextricably linked to his own life. Once the great builder was gone, the magnificent edifice he had erected began to slowly settle under its own weight, eventually turning to ruins, its former glory remembered only through legends and a few mud-brick mosques in the middle of the desert. The legacy of Mansa Musa is as multifaceted and contradictory as his personality. The view of him has changed over the centuries, with each era and each culture seeing something different in him. For Renaissance and Age of Discovery Europe, he was primarily a myth, a king of El Dorado, a symbol of Africa's untold riches to be found and taken. His image on the Catalan atlas beckoned Portuguese and Spanish mariners, becoming one of the catalysts for colonial expansion. In this perception, he was less a historical figure and more a function, a justification for European ambitions. For the Arab world, for chroniclers like Al-Umari or Ibn Khaldun, he was a real, though exotic, ruler. They admired his piety and the scale of his deeds, yet they subtly noted his barbaric naivety in matters of economics, describing with a hint of snobbery the chaos he left in Cairo. To them, he was a powerful, but not entirely civilized monarch from the periphery of the Islamic world. But his most important and complex legacy is how he is remembered in Africa itself. For many Pan-African thinkers and national liberation movements of the 20th century, Mansa Musa became a symbol of the continent's past greatness, proof that Africa had its own glorious history, its own great empires and civilizations long before the arrival of Europeans. He became a figure of pride, a refutation of colonial myths about a savage and ahistorical Africa. In this context, his generosity is not a mistake, but a manifestation of the African spirit's magnanimity, and his empire is a model to be emulated. Thus, the same man appears in history in three different guises. For some, a tempting goal, for others, a cautionary tale, for a third, a source of inspiration. His real story, full of paradoxes and ambiguity, has been buried under these myths, but it is this very story that makes him a truly great and tragic figure. So, we return to the central paradox, the greatest act of generosity that turned into ruin. Now, having walked the entire path with Mansa Musa, we can give a final, multi-layered answer. His generosity was not a mistake in the conventional sense. It was the inevitable result of a clash of civilizations. He did not understand the laws of the Mediterranean economy, not because he was foolish, but because he was the product of a completely different reality, where gold was a symbol, not a universal equivalent of value. His story is a tragedy of misunderstanding, the first global economic catastrophe in history caused not by ill will, but by a cultural divide. He showed the world Africa's wealth, but also its isolation. He brought gold to Cairo, but not the understanding of how that gold worked in a foreign system. He acted like a god dispensing gifts, not realizing that in the mortal world, every gift has a price, and sometimes that price is paid not by the recipient, but by the entire system. The solution to the paradox lies in the relativity of values. In his world, generosity created social capital, strengthening power and prestige. In Cairo's world, uncontrolled generosity, expressed in a basic economic asset, destroyed the very foundation of the social contract, which was based on the stability of money. Thus, Mansa Musa unwittingly became a great teacher of economics. Using an entire state as an example, he taught the world a brutal lesson that value is not an absolute but a conventional quantity. He proved that any economic system, no matter how powerful it seems, is a fragile construct based on balance and trust, and it takes only one person playing by different rules for that construct to collapse. His golden reign washed away the guilt of prosperity from Cairo's economy, exposing its true, vulnerable nature. Ultimately, the story of Mansa Musa extends far beyond a tale of wealth, economics, and power. It is a profound philosophical parable about the very nature of value, about what we consider true wealth. A man who possessed so much gold that he could playfully crash. The world economy ended up leaving behind something far more durable. The gold he distributed in Cairo dissolved in the chaos of hyperinflation, leaving only bitter memories. But the gold he invested in building universities and buying books turned into knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation, transforming Timbuktu into a beacon of wisdom for all of Africa. Which proved to be more valuable? The fleeting glitter of metal or the eternal light of knowledge? Mansa Musa, perhaps without fully realizing it himself, provided a comprehensive answer to this question. His journey began as a demonstration of material power and ended as an affirmation of intellectual power. He left home as a king of gold and returned as a builder of civilization. His story teaches us that true wealth is not what can be accumulated, but what can be created and passed on to others. It is a lesson that the greatest deeds can have the most unexpected and destructive consequences, and that wisdom lies not in avoiding mistakes, but in learning the right lessons from them. Mansa Musa made what was possibly the most expensive economic mistake in human history. But he also made one of the greatest investments in knowledge. And while we debate whether he was more a destroyer or a creator, his story forces us to ponder the eternal question. What will we leave behind? Gleaming but empty dust, or a legacy that will nourish the minds of generations to come?